Proclamation forward, it only applied to areas that had seceded from the Union. So where the Confederates were fighting the Union, that was where people who were in bondage were set free, not anywhere else. So people who were out west or anywhere like that, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to them. Hence why I say people could argue, did it really set people free or it didn't, depending on where they were from. So to make it national, okay, we got the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. So that means slavery is still legal. If you commit a crime, it is legal according to the United States Constitution to make you an enslaved person. Okay? Now, it was passed on April 6, 1864. And then it was adopted December 6, 1865. Okay? 1865 is also the time where the Civil War is kind of winding up. So now, you have these Reconstruction Acts going on because the 14th Amendment had to be done because when the Reconstruction Act of 1867 came, they were trying to put the southern states back in the Union. But when the southern states wanted to come back in the Union, they wanted to take all the land back that all our ancestors had rightfully purchased at auctions, and some of which had gotten lands through Sherman's Special Field Order 15. They had land grants. Now the people who previously enslaved them wanted to enslave them again. Now I want this land back. That used to be my land, and all I owned all y'all took. It wasn't tolerated. So now again, they had to do another amendment, which is one that was adopted 1868. All right, this one, the 14th, addresses citizenship and equal rights. So now, even though we were called freedmen, we were citizens. Even though the previous amendment abolished enslavement, we still weren't citizens. We were in this kind of nebulous, we don't know what you are, until they passed this law and now said people who had been previously in bondage, anyone that had been born in the soil, you were now entitled to citizenship. Well, if I'm entitled to citizenship, I should have all the benefits that come with that, including voting. Because the voting is how you set the laws. Remember we talked about the voting for establishing Mitchellism. So now, people go to try to vote, they go to try to do these things. Oh no, they met with opposition. Violent opposition. People want to do physical harm to them because they want to do what they should be able to do as a citizen. They're no longer, it's clear now that we're human beings. Because before that, they called us 3/5 of a human being. You have to have 5/5 of something to be whole. 5 over 5 would be 1 in math. If y'all didn't learn that yet, y'all will learn that part. Okay? But 3/5 means you're not whole. But now this law is to say, yes, even the people who have been in bondage are whole people, and they're whole citizens. Well, it wasn't going down that easy. So now, you had to do the 15th Amendment, which granted black men the right to vote. Didn't grant women the right to vote. That's a whole nother topic. Women's suffrage. That then later let all women be able to vote. So when this young man said we're still fighting for our civil rights, you are exactly right. Because we still don't have all things being equal for all people in the world. But the Reconstruction era, as I started out saying, started here. And some say it was simply a rehearsal for the rebuilding of a union, of taking the colonies and forming what would become the United States as one body, one country, with all citizens being equal. That people were practicing it, but that they never completed it. That they were starting up the stage of production that they never actually held. Because they didn't feel that people ever, especially people of African descent, black people, never got their full rights. That's why in 1926, Carter G. Woodson felt Negro History Week was so important, because this was going to afford the opportunity to educate people who previously did not know that black people around the world had created things, invented things, established They trained teachers to teach others. That there were people like us here on St. Helena Island that people call Gullah Geechee that were landowners. So they started to write what they call the Journal of Negro History and record now in writing, because they were literate people, that there would be something for somebody to read in the future. That they would know the stories of people of African descent and what they did to help build what is the United States. How they participated in Reconstruction. And how here we fully were able to embody Reconstruction because we ended up owning land. We ended up being full citizens on that land, building our houses, having our family compound, raising the tilling and things like that, and making sure you get yourself off to school for learning how to read and things like that. Learning how to have bilingual families that once you might be African in school where they tell you you must speak this way all the time, that you know how to do that at school. But also when you need to communicate with your people and they're not aware of what are you talking about. When I could have calmed down like that, they show so they can understand too and things like that. And then if you wanted to go elsewhere around the world, you could learn and be able to say, "Come on, stop." Oh, y'all don't understand that word. Well, how am I going to do that? So that you could become multilingual, you could be fully functioning, and you could read and know what your rights were, what laws pertain to you, what you should be receiving, what is rightfully yours. Now there is a joke some people make of it. I don't find it funny. But they say, if there's something you want to hide from the black community, you put it in a book. Because they truly believe we will not read. And nowadays, you have no excuse. Because if you don't want to come all the way to a physical library and pick up a physical book, you can go on the internet and buy a book and have it delivered on your phone, on your computer, on your tablet, on your iPad. There is no reason that you could not read today. Our ancestors suffered and died so that we would be able to. They suffered and died so that we would have land and that we would own that land all the way up 151 to 152 years later. Long time, right, young man? All right, and still go from being considered property to being property owners. And so I am always happy to be at home here on St. Helena, where my family comes from this island. They still own their family compound land that was bought back in 1862. We still have the deed and we still own the property. And my family from Palawana and Dakar Island. And we still have land, still have the property on Palawana from that time frame as well. And so to be able to know that when I speak to you about the Gullah Geechee and Reconstruction, it's not about what I just read in books, it's about what I live and I see every day. And what I've learned from my elders and my family that have lived to be over 100 years old, and sitting down and learning from them what life was like at the turn of the century and what they had been taught by their parents who had been in bondage and who lived through Reconstruction. And so, before we turn on a film that I proudly got to consult on called Reconstruction, the Second Civil War, and before we go into you being able to view the first third of that film. The film is actually 3 hours long. It's a series that was on PBS. So you're going to get to see the first segment that aired of it. And I'm going to see if y'all end up spotting me or not in it, because I'm in it too. But I consulted on that film, and it was an honor to have had the privilege to do so, because I learned there were so many people who were not aware of what Reconstruction was, or all that took place right here where we live. So before we go into that, I will answer any questions, and I know that my sister here who owed that money a while ago, she had a question before we got started, so I'm going to answer her question first, and then y'all can ask some as well. And she asked me about my position as Queen Queen. I'm the chiefess and head of state for the Gullah Geechee Nation. I was elected. A one-year election took place from 1999 to 2000. I was then installed in an official African traditional ceremony at Sullivan's Island, which is in Charleston County, South Carolina. That island was also where 40% of all Africans enslaved in America came through. So this is my second term as head of state. I'm a head of state like any other head of state in the world. I represent my people in negotiations with the U.S. government. We have the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Act as a federal thing within the U.S., and we have dual citizenship in the U.S. and the Gullah Geechee Nation as a result of a lot of that work. We also have a lot of meetings with people from Department of State and numerous guests, like we were talking about Nigeria and places earlier, have many guests that come over from West Africa, other leaders from Latin America that meet with me right here on St. Helena. I still live here on St. Helena. And so that we can talk about ways to keep culture alive in their countries around the world. Had guests from China and Brazil and all around, so that they see that what we've done here is something they want to model there. So I also still go to the United Nations and speak on behalf of my people and fight for our human rights, which is how I basically got into what I'm doing now, is because I was the first Gullah Geechee to ever speak on behalf of my people at the United Nations in 1999 in Geneva, Switzerland. So it was a long journey.
Black laborers who insisted on better wages and working conditions were regularly met with threats and violence. Vigilantes lynched whole families and used the bullwhip on men and women as they had in slavery days. In 1865, more than 2,000 black men, women, and children were reported murdered in Louisiana alone.
The violence in the South was a way to reestablish white supremacy.
These gangs that whites pick out, the guy is trying to save his money, he's trying to get ahead. A man who is inspiration to other black people in the community. He's the one that gets murdered. It amounts to systematic culling of alpha males from the black community.
The Southern legal system became an instrument of intimidation. Louisiana, Texas, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Florida passed laws that virtually prohibited freedmen from any work except as field hands. The laws were called Black Codes. The aim was slavery without the chain.
Black Codes were laws passed to control and restrict and constrain the lives of the freed people, essentially rendering them bondsmen again under law.
Some states made it illegal for freedmen to handle weapons and restricted them from buying or renting land. Black children could be seized from poor families and forced to work in the fields. If a black man had no job, he could be jailed and auctioned to a planter for his labor.
They make a travesty of the freedom that African Americans have acquired. They are so far from any notion of fairness or freedom that even Northerners who are not egalitarians say these laws are unacceptable. And so Northern Republicans are faced with a dilemma. They don't want to have a big fight with the president, but to accept the idea that Johnson's policy is a success and accept the Black Codes, they feel means giving up the victory in the Civil War.
To Louisiana's black veterans, one freedman offered this advice: I would say to every colored soldier, bring your gun home. By early 1866, Marshall Twitchell was feeling pressure from the locals who resented his.
And so, for most of you who were here when I talked about Reconstruction, now it takes you right up to the point of what starts Jim Crow era. And as I mentioned earlier, with the Stoner Rebellion of 1739, the formation of the 1740 slave codes came. The black codes mentioned here simply built on to the same language. They just now constituted a series of laws that now, like many people, if you've ever been to Charleston, South Carolina, recently, you will find that there are a lot of people in Charleston who, if they are a Gullah Geechee person and they're speaking to someone who's an Anglo person, their eyes are turned downward. And you'll wonder, why is the person doing that? And then if they're talking to another Gullah Geechee, their eyes are turned upward. And it actually is from the slave codes. And it's psychologically embedded generations later, and people are still carrying out this behavior. One of the slave codes in South Carolina was that if a white man came on the same sidewalk that a black person was on, the black person was to get off of that sidewalk. They didn't care if carriages or anything was coming and you got run over by a horse or whatever, but the law was you were to clear that sidewalk and let that person walk. So these were the same accoutrements of the slave codes that became the black codes. Brick Church that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Many of you are aware, Brick has a balcony. And most of the churches that were built during the era that that church was built during enslavement, that balcony represents the slave gallery. So we have a lot of churches here in the Sea Islands in the Gullah Geechee Nation with the slave gallery. Now, if you go the other route up this road and you go to the Chapel of Ease, and that church was built prior to Brick, they didn't have a slave gallery, but they would force the enslaved Africans to sit outside, and famous Southern sermons such as "Slaves obey your masters" would be preached. But once again, the slave gallery was the Negroes go upstairs, the whites go downstairs. What does that sound like? Does that sound familiar? Sound like what? Second class citizenship and what? Which is what era of time? Civil rights. That we talked about as 50 years since civil rights movement, right? Segregation. So again, these laws that they're talking about, and they're moving into that next segment of the Jim Crow era, that's what the black codes were about. Okay, yes, they claim by the Emancipation Proclamation, as I said earlier, certain ones of you were freed by. Okay, then we claim through the 13th Amendment. Okay, all of y'all are free. Oh, really? And then the 14th Amendment says, oh, y'all are citizens. Oh, really? We don't know about that. Okay, so what we're going to do is, since we know our amendment says slavery is abolished except in the case of a crime and punishment for a crime, this last part where they said black men had to have a job, now we enter what they call a peonage system. We enter into, remember that debt scenario we did earlier? Debtor's prison. Anything that we can use to put you back, you notice it's in your place, all right, we're going to do that. So there's a film, I love this film called Honey Dripper that has Charles Dutton in it. Well, the young man is actually walking the dirt road, similar to the dirt roads we have in St. Helena, going to look for work. In this new town, he had come off the train, he's looking for work. The white sheriff pull up next to him, where you going, boy? He's like, well, I'm looking for work. Well, you breaking the law. He said, breaking the law? I'm trying to look for... He said, no, get in the car. You're breaking the law. You're breaking the law is laziness and triflingness. And he actually locks him up to only take him to an Anglo man that owned the cotton field, to now make him work there. That man was going to look for work. But this is how illegal the whole Jim Crow system was. And so it was all really set up to say, well, okay, the law in the book says one thing, but since the states have what they call home rule, we're going to set our own rules here of laws, and we are going to operate according to that. And when that doesn't work, we're going to use armed problems. That's when the Ku Klux Klan develops and so on, and white militias and so on continue, but they existed already. Yes?
How does that fit in with what we were telling us previously with the
Catherine's.
Yeah,
On St. Catherine's.
Catherine. Made them get back the land,
Mhm.
that own, that plantation owned.
Right.
But in the case here,
That
they
didn't happen.
didn't. Okay. They
Right.
didn't own the land.
Right. Well, here they own the land. That's why we still own the land, right? What happened in St. Catherine's situation was the people who were following Tunis Campbell,
They got the forty.
and they established it right. It was under the 40 acres and a mule land settlement. So they didn't have deeds. So when those pardons came from Johnson, anyone who didn't have deeds, these so-called planters could return and say, well, I'm taking my claim back to my land. I want to be fully restored because I've been pardoned by the president.
And that shows the difference.
Exactly. That shows the juxtaposition. Now, the scene, I don't know if y'all recognize it in the film or not, but before that even, I'm on St. Catherine's. But, and there's singing as well. But the scene where I'm singing was a depiction of Edisto Island. Now, Edisto Island is the one island in the Gullah Geechee Nation where sharecropping was attempted. A small amount of the land was under sharecropping, and a bigger amount was actually under the ownership of Gullah Geechee. Edisto,
Yeah.
part of Edisto is in Charleston County, and part of it is in Carleton County, north of us. And so, James Jameson of the legendary Funk Brothers of Motown is a native of Edisto Island, too. And so, Edisto Island, when Oliver Howard, like they said, he tried to resist. He was ignoring basically that the president was even telling him to go tell these black people they're going to have to give the land back, right? He didn't want to do that. So he held off for as long as he could. But that meeting there was very significant because just like you saw Tunis Campbell, and those were armed. And they kept people off the land for as long as they could. They had no idea that if they suddenly let the black soldiers on, that they were going to come and fight them and take them off. They just thinking some more black people coming to settle there. So that got dissolved because they didn't want to kill each other. But in the Edisto case, Oliver Howard came and told them what the president said, but they never gave back the land. The people got armed themselves. There is still Freedman Village on Edisto. And as you come onto Edisto Island and cross the bridge, all of that land over there is Gullah Geechee still owned today. And we have the National Scenic Byway that goes through Edisto that we helped to fight to get for them as well. And so you had a myriad of stories. You had situations like St. Catherine and a lot of Georgia Sea Islands and coastal Georgia where these people had to give land back because they didn't bid on that land. Those were land grants under Freedman Bureau or under the Special Field Order 15. Here on St. Helena, fortunately, and in most of Beaufort County, fortunately, our ancestors bought their land. They didn't get it as a grant, they bought it. So as a result, when these cases were argued, like I mentioned Robert Smalls earlier, Robert Smalls ended up owning the McKee plantation that he had been enslaved on in the town of Beaufort. They tried to sue him all the way to the Supreme Court to get it back. Because the McKees thought, like the St. Catherine's man, Wahlberg, that's mine. I should get it back. They said, but you can't. Because he actually bid on it. He bought it. This wasn't like we just took it, confiscated, get it. This was we bought, he had paperwork, sorry, you lose. So we had a very complex time frame here when you start talking about Reconstruction. And why today some people still own land and some people are on renting land. They're renting. They never ended up owning, or there are families where they can say, well, wow, now that I'm doing my family genealogy, my people weren't born in Beaufort. They were born up in Charleston someplace. But what the hell come they came to Beaufort? Because I got paperwork here, they came to Beaufort in 1865. They came to Beaufort because they could get land here and not get run off. You see what I mean? As opposed to being in an area that was largely still occupied by Confederates and the returning Confederates. And so you have Lincolnville, South Carolina, which is outside the city of Charleston. That was a town that was founded because these black men were steadily trying to go forward to be independent. They couldn't do it in Charleston. They could not get places in Charleston. So they actually got on a railroad train. and the railroad company had all this land because of clearing tracks and getting things that they were starting to sell. So they got off at what they call pump pond then, because that was a stop where they could get more things they needed, water, you know, coal and all this. They call it pump pond. Well, these men said, well, this land is for sale, we want this. And they bought about 300 and some acres of land there and then created this town called Lincolnville, South Carolina. So you have a lot of different dynamics when you start talking about land ownership here, but the majority of Gullah Geechees can show you that somewhere within the period from the Civil War to the end of Reconstruction, their family members started owning land. This became complicated when we fought for the Cultural Protection Overlay District for St. Helena Island. Because within that law, we wanted a clause that the only people who had a family compound exemption, in addition, that's another section of the Beaufort County zoning standard ordinance, that would be people who own land for at least 100 years. Okay? And that was because we were already well past, we were past 150 years past when these people allowed them to own land already. So we said 100 years. Oh, that's ridiculous. You can't say that because most black people didn't own no land 100 years ago. That was because the people sitting in the county didn't know the history. And we said, yes, they did. Most Gullah Geechee families owned that land for 100 years already. So this was to prevent new people who are coming in buying up people's land for now having the same density and building pattern as us. Because on a family compound, you can have 2 or 3 houses on 1 acre land. We didn't want somebody coming in and buying 100 acres and putting 3 houses on every acre. Because that's when you get what you call PUDs, Planned Unit Development. And that's part of our destruction. So we had to negotiate it because there were people in Dale and up near Well Branch who they had only come to be landowners within about a 50 to 70 year range. And so as not to leave them out, it got negotiated to 50 years that your family, come on in, would have had to own land for at least 50 years to be even considered for a family compound exemption. And then for St. Helena, we got a cultural protection overlay district to protect Gullah Geechee culture in addition to having that family compound. But it's very interesting because when you see through this film and the things I've talked about today, there can constantly be legislation. There can constantly be things written on the books, but a law is only as good as those who enforce it. And if you don't hold on to your rights, know your rights, fight for your rights, there you go. Somebody else is going to try to run over you. So this film, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you go to GullahGeecheeNation.com or if you're on @GullahGeechee at Twitter or Gullah Geechee Nation on Facebook, if you look at the link for today's event, you with me and with me carrying the basket, if y'all recognize, y'all probably like, that's an old picture, how did it get color? That was actually me in real life. That picture, if you click there and go to our blog, you'll see some history about this, but then at the bottom, the whole 3 hours of this documentary series is on there as well.